6 months had passed since the Battle of Kethra, and the galaxy had not stopped talking about what the humans had done. Ambassador Lyris Vorin stood before the assembled delegates of the Galactic Concord in the Great Chamber on Nexus Prime, surrounded by representatives from over 200 spacefaring species who had gathered to hear her speak. She looked different from the desperate leader who had broadcast that plea for help into the void, her silver eyes now carrying a confidence that came from having witnessed something that had changed her understanding of the universe forever. "Honored delegates," she began, her voice strong and clear, "I come before you today to share what my people experienced during the darkest days of our existence, and to introduce you to the species that saved us from extinction." A murmur ran through the chamber as the human delegation entered and took their seats in the section reserved for new member civilizations. The front of the group sat Dr. Patricia Chen, the official ambassador representing the United Earth government, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed out of place among the hardened military officers who accompanied her. Lyris continued her address, describing the invasion in vivid detail, the burning cities, the murdered civilians, the absolute certainty that her entire species would be erased from existence without anyone lifting a finger to stop it. "The Galactic Concord refused our plea for assistance," she said without accusation, citing treaties and protocols and political considerations that I now understand were simply excuses to avoid confronting a difficult situation. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "But the humans did not refuse," Lyris continued, "and they did not ask what we could offer them in return for their help. They simply came because we needed them." She described the battle in terms that the assembled diplomats could understand. The impossible odds, the heroic sacrifices, the determination of soldiers who had traveled across the galaxy to defend strangers. When she finished speaking, the chamber was silent for a long moment before the delegate from the Kryn Federation rose to address the human ambassador. "Your species has done something remarkable," the Kryn delegate admitted, "but surely you must want something in return. No civilization acts without self-interest, and the Concord would like to know what price you expect the Valorians to pay for their rescue." Dr. Patricia Chen looked genuinely confused by the question. "We asked for nothing," she said simply, "and we expect nothing. Someone needed help, and we helped them. Is that really so difficult to understand?" The chamber erupted in debate as delegates struggled to comprehend a concept that seemed foreign to their entire way of thinking. For millennia, the Galactic Concord had operated on principles of mutual benefit and calculated exchange, where every action was weighed against potential gain and every alliance was built on shared interests rather than shared values. The idea that a species would sacrifice hundreds of its own people to protect strangers without any expectation of reward was something they had never encountered before. Over the following weeks, the debates continued as the Concord tried to figure out how to categorize these strange humans who had upset their understanding of how civilizations were supposed to behave. Some argued that humanity must be playing a long game, building political capital that they would eventually cash in for territory or trade advantages, were simply too primitive to understand proper diplomatic protocol, and would eventually learn to act like everyone else. But a growing number of delegates began to wonder if perhaps humanity had something to teach them about what it meant to be truly civilized. Back on Kethra, the reconstruction of the capital city had begun under the supervision of human engineers who had volunteered to help rebuild what the Scrath had destroyed. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Graves had survived his wounds, though the doctors said he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. He stood at the dedication ceremony for the memorial that had been erected at Velcorin Bridge, a towering monument of white stone engraved with the names of every human who had fallen descending that crossing. Beside him stood Corporal Nathan Torres, who had been promoted to sergeant for his actions during the battle, and Private Ashley Morgan, who had received commendations for bravery that most soldiers twice her age would never earn. The other survivors of the 47th Expeditionary Unit had gathered as well, their numbers painfully reduced from the force that had departed Earth so many months ago. Ambassador Lyris approached Daniel after the ceremony, her blue face still marked with the tears she had shed while reading the names of the fallen. "I have a question that I have wanted to ask you since the day you arrived," she said quietly, "and I hope you will not think it impolite." "Please," Daniel replied, "ask anything you want." "Why?" Lyris said, the single word carrying the weight of everything she had witnessed. "Why did you come here and fight and die for people you had never met and will never truly know? Why did you sacrifice so much for strangers?" Daniel considered the question for a long moment, looking at the names carved in stone before him. He thought of Kevin Marshall, who had brought down a building on himself to save the soldiers under his command. He thought of Ryan Ellis, who had rammed his ship into the enemy rather than accept defeat. He thought of all the young men and women who would never go home because they had chosen to answer a call for help from across the stars. "Because you asked," he said finally, "and because if someone is in trouble and you have the ability to help them, then you have the responsibility to try. That is what my father taught me and his father taught him, and it is what I hope my children will learn someday." Lyris nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her ancient eyes. "The Valorians had a saying that we taught our children for thousands of years," she said, "and it went like this: in darkness we are alone." She paused and looked at the human soldiers gathered around her, the ones who had come through fire and smoke to save her people from extinction. "After what you have done for us, we have added a new verse," she continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "And now our children will learn, in darkness we are alone, until the humans come through the smoke." Daniel felt tears forming in his own eyes as the weight of those words settled over him. He reached out and took the ambassador's hand in his own. "You will never be alone again," he promised her, "and whenever you need us, wherever you need us, we will come." Above them, the stars shone down on a galaxy that would never be quite the same. The Scrath Dominion had been humbled for the first time in their long history of conquest. The Galactic Concord had witnessed something that challenged everything they believed about how civilizations were supposed to behave. And a young species from a distant arm of the galaxy had announced their presence to the universe in the most human way possible, by running toward the fire instead of away from it. Because that was who they were, and that was what they would always be. The morning after the battle at Velkarin Bridge brought a terrible silence that seemed to hang over the ruined city like a shroud. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Graves walked among the bodies of his fallen Marines, his heart breaking with each familiar face he recognized among the dead. 219 soldiers had given their lives holding that bridge, and their sacrifice had saved 60,000 innocent civilians who would have been slaughtered without mercy by the Scrath invaders. Kevin Marshall was not among the survivors. During the final hours of the battle, a massive Scrath armored column had attempted to flank the human positions by pushing through a narrow street to the north of the bridge approach. Kevin had seen them coming, and had made a decision that would haunt Daniel for the rest of his life. "I need everyone to fall back to the secondary positions," Kevin had said over the radio, his voice calm, despite what he was about to. "Kevin, what are you doing?" Daniel had demanded. "What needs to be done," Kevin had replied, "and tell my wife I love her." He had grabbed a demolition pack and charged toward a building that overlooked the enemy column, planting the explosives on the support beams, while Scrath weapons fire tore the walls apart around him. When he triggered the detonation, the entire structure collapsed onto the advancing enemy, crushing hundreds of Scrath soldiers and blocking the street completely. Kevin had known he would not escape the blast. He had done it anyway. In orbit above Kethra, Admiral Christine Holt had fought her own desperate battle against the Scrath fleet. The human ships were outgunned and outnumbered, but they fought with a tactical creativity that the Scrath had never encountered before. Captain Ryan Ellis, of the USS Dauntless, had performed the most audacious maneuver of the engagement when his ship sustained critical damage and lost main power. Rather than abandon his vessel and allow the Scrath to claim victory, Ryan had ordered all non-essential personnel to the escape pods, and then aimed his crippled frigate directly at the heart of the enemy formation. "All hands, this is the captain," Ryan had announced over the ship-wide intercom, "and I want you to know that it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve alongside each and every one of you. Now get to the pods, and let me do what needs to be done." The Dauntless struck a Scrath dreadnought at full ramming speed, the impact tearing both vessels apart in a spectacular explosion that lit up the darkness of space for a brief and terrible moment. Ryan Ellis and the 47 crew members who had chosen to remain with him were killed instantly. But their sacrifice had opened a gap in the Scrath formation that Christine exploited ruthlessly, pouring fire into the exposed enemy ships and destroying 3 more dreadnoughts before they could recover. The tide of the space battle began to turn as Scrath reinforcements that had been promised by Krixtal failed to arrive. Unknown to the warlord, 2 additional human carrier groups had intercepted those reinforcements at the edge of the system and engaged them in a brutal 3-day battle that left both sides bloodied and exhausted. The Scrath were learning a hard lesson about what happened when they underestimated humanity. On the ground, Daniel received orders to push forward and assault the Scrath command post, where Krixtal himself was directing the invasion. The surviving Marines gathered their weapons and their courage and began the long advance through streets filled with rubble and bodies, and the smoking remains of a city that had once been beautiful. Nathan Torres had been promoted to acting squad leader after losing 3 commanding officers in the previous day's fighting, and he led his small team through the maze of destruction with a grim determination that inspired those around him. Ashley Morgan stayed close beside him, her rifle ready and her eyes scanning every shadow for threats. She had been wounded twice during the bridge battle, once in the shoulder and once in the leg, but she had refused evacuation and continued fighting alongside her brothers and sisters in arms. "We are almost there," Nathan said quietly as they approached the hull. Towering structure, where Scrath intelligence indicated Krixtal had established his headquarters. The final assault was a nightmare of close-quarters combat, as the Marines fought their way through floor after floor of enemy resistance. Daniel led from the front as he always had, his rifle spitting fire at any Scrath that dared to stand in their path. When they finally reached the command chamber at the top of the building, they found Krixtal waiting for them. The Scrath warlord was even more massive than his soldiers, standing nearly 4 meters tall, with armor that seemed to absorb the light around it. "So the humans have come to die at my feet," Krixtal said with contempt, "and I will enjoy adding your skulls to my collection." 4 Marines rushed forward to engage the warlord, and all 4 were cut down in seconds by his massive blade. Daniel stepped forward alone, knowing that this was the moment everything depended upon. Brutal and fast, with Krixtal's superior size and strength driving Daniel back across the chamber. A savage blow from the warlord's blade tore through Daniel's armor and opened a terrible wound across his stomach that should have killed him instantly. But Daniel did not fall. He caught Krixtal's next strike on his rifle, shattering the weapon, but creating an opening that he exploited with his last remaining strength. His combat knife found the gap in the warlord's throat armor and drove deep into the soft flesh beneath. Krixtal staggered backward, clutching at the wound, as dark blood poured between his armored fingers. "How?" the warlord gasped. "How can such weak creatures defeat me?" Daniel fell to his knees, his vision fading as his own blood pooled on the floor around him. "Because we never give up," he said softly, "and we never stop fighting for what we believe in." Krixtal collapsed and did not rise again. Rushed to Daniel's side, applying emergency medical treatment that barely managed to keep him alive long enough for evacuation to a medical ship in orbit. Across the planet, Scrath forces received the transmission that their commander was dead. The effect was immediate and devastating to their morale, as unit after unit broke contact with human forces and began retreating toward their landing zones. Within hours, the Scrath offensive had collapsed entirely. The invasion of Kethra was over. Christine Holt watched from the bridge of the Valiant as the remaining Scrath vessels withdrew from the system, their dreadnoughts limping away in defeat for the first time in recorded galactic history. She felt no joy at the victory, only a profound sadness for all those who had given their lives to achieve it. Ryan Ellis and his crew, Kevin Marshall, 219 Marines at Velcorin Bridge, and countless others whose names would be remembered forever by those they had saved. The cost of honor had been terrible, but the Valorian people would survive because humanity had chosen to answer their call for help, and that was worth everything they had sacrificed. The ancient bridge of Velcorin stretched across the great river that divided the capital city, its white stone arches standing for over 3,000 years as a symbol of everything the Valorian people believed in. It was a monument to peace and cooperation, built in an age when their ancestors had ended generations of conflict and united their world under a single banner of hope. Now it was the only escape route for nearly 60,000 civilians who were fleeing the burning city with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the desperate prayer that someone would protect them long enough to reach safety. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Graves stood at the eastern approach to the bridge and surveyed the defensive positions his Marines had established over the past 6 hours. They had lost nearly 200 soldiers in the initial landing, but the survivors had regrouped and consolidated into a fighting force of just under 800 men and women, who now stood between the Scrath army and the helpless refugees behind them. "How many are we looking at?" Daniel asked Sergeant Marcus Webb, who was studying the enemy formations through a pair of tactical binoculars. "Best estimate is around 12,000, Marcus replied grimly, "and they have armor support and artillery positions on the ridgeline to the north. If they decide to push hard, we are going to have a very difficult time holding them back." Daniel nodded slowly and looked at the bridge behind him, where a steady stream of Valorians continued to cross to the relative safety of the western districts. "Then we hold them back anyway," he said simply, "because those people are counting on us and we are not going to let them down." Kevin Marshall approached with a squad of engineers who had been working through the night to fortify their positions. "We have set up overlapping fields of fire along the main approach," Kevin reported, "and the heavy weapons teams are positioned to cover the flanks. It is not perfect, but it will have to do." "What about the civilians?" Daniel asked. "How long until the evacuation is complete?" "At the current rate, maybe 9 or 10 hours, Kevin answered, "and that is assuming nothing goes wrong." Daniel knew that something would go wrong, because something always did, but he kept that thought to himself as he moved along the defensive line, offering words of encouragement to the exhausted soldiers who had not slept since arriving on this world. He found Nathan Torres and Ashley Morgan sharing a meal of field rations behind a makeshift barricade of rubble and overturned vehicles. Ashley looked different from the frightened young woman he had seen in the dropship, her eyes now carrying a hardness that came only from seeing combat and surviving it. "How are you holding up?" Daniel asked her. "I am scared," Ashley admitted honestly. "There are children on that bridge, and someone has to protect them." Nathan smiled with pride at his young companion. "She saved 3 wounded Marines during the landing," he told Daniel, "and carried them to safety under enemy fire, while the rest of us were still trying to figure out which way was up." Daniel placed a hand on Ashley's shoulder. "That is what being a Marine means," he said, "and I am proud to serve alongside you." The Scrath attack began at dawn, with a thunderous barrage from the artillery positions on the northern ridge. Explosions tore through the human lines, sending debris and bodies flying through the air as the soldiers scrambled for cover. Then came the ground assault, thousands of Scrath warriors charging across the open ground toward the bridge, with a terrifying speed that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. Kevin was everywhere at once, directing fire and rallying troops and pulling wounded soldiers to safety, with a seemingly endless reserve of strength and determination. "Hold the line," he shouted above the roar of weapons fire, "and do not give them a single inch of ground. We are the only thing standing between these monsters and those civilians." Nathan led a small team through the chaos to reinforce a section of the line that was about to collapse, arriving just in time to drive back a Scrath breakthrough with grenades and concentrated rifle fire. The battle raged for hours without pause, as wave after wave of enemy forces crashed against the human defenses, like an ocean trying to erode a stubborn cliff. By midday, the Marines had suffered terrible casualties, with nearly a quarter of their strength either dead or too wounded to fight, but they had not retreated a single step from their positions. Daniel received word that a Scrath artillery unit had repositioned to a location where it could fire directly onto the bridge itself, threatening to cut off the evacuation entirely. "I need volunteers for a flanking mission," he announced to the soldiers around him, "and I will not lie about the odds. Whoever goes will probably not come back." Nathan stepped forward immediately, followed by Ashley and a dozen other Marines, who did not hesitate, even knowing what they were being asked to do. They moved through the sewers beneath the city, navigating by the dim light of their tactical flashlights, as the sounds of battle echoed above them. When they emerged behind enemy lines, they found the artillery position guarded by nearly 50 Scrath soldiers. "There are too many of them," one of the Marines whispered. "Then we will just have to be faster and meaner," Nathan replied. "And remember why we are here. Those guns cannot be allowed to fire on the bridge." The attack was swift and brutal, the humans using surprise and aggression to overcome their numerical disadvantage. Ashley fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself, taking down 3 Scrath warriors with precise shots that found the gaps in their armor. When it was over, the artillery position was destroyed, but only Nathan, Ashley, and 4 others remained standing among the bodies of their fallen comrades. Back at the bridge, the Scrath commander sent a message demanding the humans surrender and promising them quick deaths if they complied. Kevin delivered Daniel's response personally by shooting the Scrath messenger between its 4 red eyes. "The answer is no," he said to the enemy soldiers, watching from across the battlefield. The fighting continued through the afternoon and into the evening, as the last of the refugees finally crossed to safety on the western shore. Lyris Voren had refused to leave until every one of her people was accounted for, and she stood at the bridge entrance, watching the humans continue their impossible defense. She saw soldiers who could barely stand, propping each other up to keep fighting. She saw medics treating the wounded while under fire, refusing to abandon anyone who still had a chance. She saw humans dying to protect people they had never met and would never know, giving everything they had for strangers from a distant world. Tears streamed down her blue face as she finally allowed herself to be escorted across the bridge to safety. "Who are these people?" she asked Chorus, in a voice filled with wonder. "They call themselves Marines," Chorus replied, "and I do not think the galaxy has ever seen anything quite like them before." As darkness fell over the battlefield, the Scrath finally pulled back to regroup, leaving the humans in control of the bridge approach for another day. Night. 9 hours of continuous combat had reduced the Marine force to less than 500 effective soldiers. But they had held the line. and 60,000 Valorian civilians were alive because of it. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace above Kethra like a sudden storm appearing on a clear day, and Admiral Christine Holt stood on the bridge of the USS Valiant, surveying the nightmare that awaited them. 37 Scrath dreadnoughts circled the planet like vultures waiting for their prey to stop breathing, their dark hulls bristling with weapons that had destroyed entire civilizations before the humans had even learned to make fire. The Valorian defense platforms were nothing but burning debris now, scattered across the orbital lanes like the bones of a creature that had tried and failed to protect its home. Christine studied the tactical display and counted the odds against them. The humans had brought 12 ships, 3 carriers, and 9 support vessels against an enemy fleet that outnumbered and outgunned them by a factor of 3 to 1. "Admiral," her communications officer called out, "we are receiving a transmission from the lead Scrath. Vessel entered." "Put it through," Christine ordered, her voice betraying no hint of the concern she felt inside. The view screen flickered and displayed the image of a Scrath commander, a massive insectoid creature with 4 glowing red eyes and mandibles that clicked together as it spoke in a harsh mechanical voice, translated by the ship's computer. "I am Crixtal, warlord of the Scrath Dominion and conqueror of Kethra," the creature announced with obvious pride, "and you must be the humans we have heard so little about. The galaxy considers you primitive and insignificant, barely worth noticing among the greater powers." Christine allowed herself a small smile before responding. "I am Admiral Christine Holt of the United Earth Fleet," she said calmly, "and I am here to demand the immediate withdrawal of your forces from this planet, and the cessation of all hostile actions against the Valorian people." Crixtal made a sound that might have been laughter, a horrible grinding noise that echoed through the bridge speakers. "You demand nothing, little human," the warlord replied, "and you have brought a handful of ships to challenge the might of the Scrath Dominion. Your arrogance is amusing, but your stupidity will be punished. You are welcome to share the fate of these worthless Valorians." The transmission ended abruptly, and Christine turned to her tactical officer with determination in her eyes. "Launch all marine dropships," she commanded, "and tell the fleet to engage the enemy. We are going to show these insects what happens when they underestimate humanity." Below in the hangar bay of the USS Resolute, Lieutenant Commander Daniel Graves led his Marines into the waiting dropships as alarms blared and the ship shuddered from the first exchange of weapons fire in orbit. Corporal Nathan Torres climbed into his assigned craft and took a seat next to Private Ashley Morgan, who was gripping her rifle so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "First combat drop?" Nathan asked her gently. Ashley nodded, without speaking, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Stay close to me down there," Nathan told her, "and do exactly what Sergeant Marshall says. We are going to get through this together." Staff Sergeant Kevin Marshall stood at the front of the dropship, addressing the 20 Marines under his command. "Listen up," Kevin said, in a voice that cut through the chaos around them, "because I'm only going to say this once. When those doors open, you will see things that will make you want to run and hide and never come out again. The Scrath are bigger than us and meaner than us, and they have been killing people across this galaxy for longer than our species has existed." He paused and looked at each of them in turn. "But they have never fought humans before," Kevin continued, "and they do not know what we are capable of when someone threatens the people we have sworn to protect. Today, we are going to teach them a lesson they will never forget." The dropship launched into the burning atmosphere of Kethra, joining dozens of others as they descended toward the capital city through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Nathan watched through the small window as 2 dropships to their left exploded in balls of orange flame, their occupants never even reaching the ground they had come so far to defend. "Brace for impact," the pilot shouted over the intercom. "We are taking fire, and I cannot avoid all of it." A violent shudder ran through the craft as something struck the engine compartment, and suddenly they were spinning out of control toward the burning city below. Nathan grabbed Ashley and pulled her down as the world became a blur of noise and motion and terror. The dropship crashed through the roof of what had once been a marketplace, tearing through stalls and structures before finally coming to rest in a pile of debris and dust. Flames. The pilot was dead, his body crushed by the collapsed cockpit, and 3 other Marines had been killed on impact. Kevin was the first to recover, kicking open the emergency hatch and pulling wounded soldiers out of the wreckage with strength that seemed impossible for a man of his age. "Move, move, move," he shouted as enemy fire began to strike the ground around them. "Get to cover and return fire. We did not come all this way to die in a burning hole." Nathan helped Ashley to her feet and pushed her toward a collapsed wall that offered some protection from the incoming weapons. Through the smoke and flames, he could see them for the first time. The Scrath ground forces. They were monsters, standing nearly 3 meters tall on 8 powerful legs, their bodies covered in natural armor that gleamed like polished obsidian in the firelight. They moved with terrifying speed despite their size, their weapons firing bolts of superheated plasma that turned everything they touched into ash and cinders. But the Marines were already fighting back. Lance Corporal Derek Hayes had set up a heavy machine gun position and was pouring fire into the advancing enemy, his rounds sparking off their armor, but occasionally finding gaps that sent the creatures tumbling to the ground. Kevin rallied the survivors and organized them into firing teams, directing their efforts with the calm precision of someone who had done this many times before. "Aim for the joints," he called out, "and the gaps between the armor plates. They bleed just like anything else, and they can die just like anything else." Across the city, other human units were making similar stands, emerging from crashed dropships and burning landing zones to face an enemy that had expected no real resistance. The Valorians who witnessed these first moments of contact could not believe what they were seeing. Through the smoke came these strange creatures, these humans, smaller than the Scrath and softer and seemingly so fragile. Yet they did not run, and they did not surrender, and they did not stop fighting, even when everything seemed hopeless. Ambassador Lyris Vorin watched from a shelter beneath the palace as reports came in from across the capital. "They are actually fighting," Cora said in amazement, "and they are holding their ground against the Scrath." "I did not think such a thing was possible." Lyris felt something stir in her chest that she had not felt since the invasion began. It was hope, small and fragile but real. The humans had come through the smoke just as she had prayed someone would, and now the fate of her entire species rested on the shoulders of soldiers who had traveled across the galaxy to answer the call of strangers. She did not know if they could win, but for the first time in 17 solar cycles, she believed they might. The sky above Kethra burned orange and red as another wave of Scrath warships descended through the clouds. And Ambassador Lyris Vorin stood at the shattered window of her palace, watching her world die, slowly, before her ancient eyes. She had lived for nearly 400 years, longer than most of her kind, and in all that time, she had never witnessed such destruction, such cruelty, such absolute disregard for life itself. The Valorians were not warriors, and they had never pretended to be anything other than what they were. Scholars who loved knowledge, artists who created beauty, diplomats who believed that words could solve any conflict if spoken with enough wisdom and patience. But words meant nothing to the Scrath. The insectoid invaders had arrived 17 solar cycles ago without warning or negotiation, their massive dreadnoughts blocking out the stars like a plague of metal locusts descending upon a helpless field of grain. For its resources, its strategic position, and perhaps simply because they could take it, and no one in the galaxy seemed willing or able to stop them. Lyris turned away from the window as her aide, a young Valorian named Chorus, entered the chamber, with fear written across his blue-skinned features. "Ambassador," he said in a trembling voice, "the outer districts have fallen, and the Scrath ground forces are advancing toward the capital faster than we anticipated." "How long do we have?" Lyris asked, her voice steady, despite the terror growing in her hearts. "Perhaps 3 days, perhaps less," Chorus replied, "and the evacuation ships cannot hold everyone. There are simply too many civilians and too few vessels." Lyris nodded slowly and walked to her communication console, her long fingers hovering over the controls as she considered what she was about to do. The Galactic Concord had already rejected their plea for assistance, citing ancient treaties and political complications that meant nothing to the thousands of Valorians dying in the streets below. The other spacefaring races had turned their backs, afraid of angering the Scrath Dominion, afraid of being next if they dared to intervene. But there was one more option, one final desperate hope that Lyris had hesitated to pursue until now. Deep in the unexplored regions of the galaxy, in a distant arm that most species considered too primitive to bother with, there existed a young race that had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. They called themselves humans. The Concord knew little about them, except that they were violent by nature, prone to conflict among themselves, and possessed a strange habit of rushing headlong into situations that did not concern them. Some called them reckless, others called them foolish. A few whispered that they were dangerous in ways the galaxy had not yet understood. Lyris activated the distress beacon and broadcast it across every frequency she could reach, sending her desperate plea into the void, with no guarantee that anyone would hear it or care enough to respond. "This is Ambassador Lyris Voren of the Valorian people," she spoke into the console, "and we are dying. The Scrath Dominion has invaded our world without provocation, and we have no means to defend ourselves. We beg any species capable of rendering assistance to please help us. We will offer whatever we have in return. We simply ask that you save our children." She ended the transmission and sat down heavily in her chair, feeling older than she had ever felt before. Chorus looked at her with something between hope and despair in his large silver eyes. "Do you think anyone will come?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," Lyris admitted, "but I had to try." 9,000 light-years away, in a region of space that the Galactic Concord had largely ignored, the message reached a communications relay station orbiting Earth's moon. Within minutes, it was forwarded to United Earth Command, where admirals and generals gathered in a war room to discuss what they had received. Admiral Christine Holt sat at the head of the table, her gray eyes scanning the translated text of the Valorian distress call as her colleagues debated around her. "This is not our fight," argued one of the generals, "and we have no treaties with these Valorians, no obligations, no strategic interest in their survival." "The Scrath are a dominant military power," added another voice, "and engaging them would be foolish at best and suicidal at worst." Christine listened to the arguments without speaking, her mind already made up long before she entered the room. When the voices finally quieted, she stood and addressed them all with the calm authority that had earned her command of the Second Fleet. "Someone asked for help," she said simply, "and that is reason enough for me." The debate continued for another hour, but in the end, the orders were given. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Graves received the news aboard the USS Resolute, as his unit, the 47th Expeditionary Marine Unit, prepared for a routine training exercise that would now be canceled. He gathered his officers and senior enlisted personnel in the briefing room and explained the situation in plain terms. "We are going to a planet called Kethra," he told them. "Help people we have never met against an enemy we have never fought. I will not lie to you and tell you this will be easy, because everything I have read about the Scrath tells me it will be the hardest thing any of us have ever done." Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, a broad-shouldered man with 20 years of service behind him, leaned forward in his chair. "Sir, why are we doing this?" he asked, not in challenge, but in genuine curiosity. Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because they asked," he said, "and because if we do not help them, no one else will. That is who we are, and that is what we do." The Marines of the 47th began their preparations immediately, checking weapons and loading supplies, and saying quiet goodbyes to loved ones through recorded messages that might be their last. In the barracks, Corporal Nathan Torres sat on his bunk and looked at a photograph of his family back in Arizona, wondering if he would ever see them again. Across from him, Private First Class Ashley Morgan, barely 22 years old, with bright red hair and freckles scattered across her nose, was writing a letter to her younger brother, explaining why she had to go so far away to help strangers she had never known. Staff Sergeant Kevin Marshall walked among the troops, offering words of encouragement and checking their gear with the practiced eye of a veteran who had survived 3 previous deployments. "Listen up," Kevin said to a group of nervous young Marines, "and I will tell you something important. Fear is normal, and anyone who says they are not afraid is either lying or stupid. The trick is to keep moving forward anyway, and trust the person next to you to do the same." 3 days later, the human fleet departed Earth orbit and made the jump to hyperspace, beginning the long journey across the galaxy toward a world they had never seen and a people they had never met. Behind them, they left families and friends and comfortable lives, trading safety for uncertainty, because somewhere in the darkness, someone had called out for help. And humans had always answered that call.